In the Western movies that shaped Hollywood, the cowboy usually plays the hero, while indigenous peoples are shown as the antagonists. But history tells a different story. In many native nations, women were recognized for their skills. They took part in decision-making, produced, healed, and sustained community networks, a reality far removed from that of European women of the same era, who faced strict legal and social limitations. When we take a closer look at these cultures, the picture becomes broader. They don't fit into Hollywood's labels. These are diverse societies, each with their own rules and political and spiritual systems, where women's work carried real weight. Through this lens, we gain insight into the challenges millions of indigenous women have faced over time, and the pressures that still affect their lands and bodies today, without reducing their stories to caricatures. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson saw the Iroquois Confederacy as a kind of political laboratory. Different peoples united by stable rules, councils, and agreements to keep power in balance. In that system, women weren't pushed to the sidelines. They led ceremonies, kept collective memory alive, and managed everyday matters. A key element was the Women's Council, which had the power to choose chiefs and remove them when they failed, a mechanism that helped preserve balance and public accountability. In some communities, stories about sexual customs drew attention. It was said that in the Kaga tribe, young men were tested by spending a night with an elder woman, whose satisfaction served as proof of their maturity. If they failed, they went back to learn more. There were also records of unions where women took the initiative and set the terms of married life, flipping the usual expectations. In this way, leadership, ritual, and kinship formed a web where women's authority carried real weight and upheld a politics of consensus, one that echoed in ideas of governance far beyond the Iroquois forests. When the pressure built up on certain men in the village, they would escape into the forest and disappear into hiding spots prepared ahead of time. If more than one ran off, search parties were formed. The women organized themselves, followed the trails, found the runaways, and brought them back so that the community's work wouldn't come to a halt. This drive to take action wasn't limited to daily life. In times of war, whether between tribes or against invaders pushing westward, women's presence in combat was very real. Among the Omaha, Cheyenne, Ponca, Sioux, and other nations, many took their place on the front lines. They didn't go out of obligation. They entered the fight with skill in weapons and tactics learned through life alongside fathers, brothers, and partners. Accounts of battles between Texas Rangers and Comanches record this reality from another angle. The Rangers didn't make distinctions between targets. They said they feared the women warriors because they rarely lowered their weapons, kept setting up ambushes, and fought to the end. A determination that changed how the Rangers saw both their enemy and the war itself. Out of the tensions between Native peoples and the U.S. Army came a lasting story, that of a Cheyenne warrior nicknamed 10 Without Nails. According to oral tradition, during the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, she was the one who brought down Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, a moment that came to symbolize one of the most significant victories of the Plains peoples against the invasion of their land. Years later, in letters from campaigns against the Comanches in the 1870s, Captain Robert Custer wrote that he had seen an indigenous fighter who handled both a bow and a revolver with precision, moving forward without retreating. His description didn't dwell on exoticism, but instead on her discipline, skill, and determination to stay standing when many would have fallen. These accounts, drawn from collective memory and battlefield testimony, show that women stood at the heart of the conflict, not on its margins. In that light, ideas that pushed them into purely domestic roles lose their weight. Their communities had diverse family arrangements. Monogamy was common, but polygamy also had its place, shaping ways of life adapted to their time and land. In some indigenous societies, marriage followed rules guided by myths and collective agreements. Even if satisfied with his first marriage, a man could ask his wife's sister to become his second wife without needing the first wife's approval. This wasn't seen as a rupture, but as a custom upheld by oral tradition. One story tells of two sisters who lived alone until a visitor from the sky arrived and taught them how to farm and cook. From that visit came the idea that each man could have two wives, and that belief gave legitimacy to the practice. Beyond the stories, there were also practical ways to deal with population balance and survival. In times when there were fewer men, or when births needed to be limited, the group found solutions that balanced affection and survival. Some women took on the role of temporary wives so they wouldn't be left without companionship or descendants, something considered a loss for the community. The same pragmatism shaped young people's relationships. Couples could live together, try out life as partners, and if things didn't work out, separate without conflict. That kind of flexibility, which in urban society would only become common with civil marriage in the second half of the 20th century, had already appeared there as a way to adjust emotions, alliances, and responsibilities, keeping the community united while allowing each person to find their place. Few people know that the respect for women in certain indigenous nations was once used as a weapon of pressure. When European colonizers realized that women held central roles in families and councils, they began capturing them to force ceasefires and open negotiations. This clash reveals an internal system with its own rules. Among them was the right of a wife to decide on divorce. If a hunter came home and found his belongings outside, the marriage was over. No debate, and he simply went back to his mother's house. There was also a rule that the husband had to live with his mother-in-law for at least 2 years, a time when he learned his duties and ties to the clan. It was also the man's job to take care of childbirth, ensuring both care and resources. Births were expected to happen in regular cycles of 4 years. If the interval grew longer, the group would look into the causes and offer support, since the community's continuity depended on collective agreements. In this way, respect, conflict, and household rules formed part of the same social fabric, where women's authority guided decisions and set boundaries. A lot of people still repeat a false idea about the girls and native tribes of the Old West, that they were savages and dirty. History tells a different story. Looking at everyday life from that time, it's clear that many colonizers had hygiene habits that seem strange to us now. Among newly arrived pilgrims, being clean was about clothes, not the body. A spotless shirt mattered more than a bath, even if they smelled bad. The odors of manure and horses were part of daily work. Lice and fleas were common. For them, water wasn't tied to daily cleanliness but to rituals and fears, so bathing seemed unnecessary. As long as you looked presentable, that was enough to show status. There was also a religious factor. Around 1620, some devotional movements glorified suffering, and some people avoided bathing and even endured sores as proof of faith. In that context, water mattered more as a symbol than as a form of care. In contrast, native peoples bathed frequently in rivers and lakes, connecting hygiene, health, and balance with the environment. Still, they were labeled as barbarians because their customs didn't fit the European gaze. Revisiting this history clears up that misconception and shows that ideas of cleanliness come from context, not superiority. Between rivers and waterfalls, two worldviews collided. For many indigenous peoples, entering the water was an act of hygiene, balance, and spiritual renewal. For European settlers, however, the legacy of strict customs and religious interpretations long defined bathing outdoors as indecent, if not outright sinful. The clash wasn't just about habits, but about values. What for some united body and land, for others threatened order and decorum. What's ironic is that centuries later, Europe itself normalized bathing in rivers and lakes, and Western culture began to glorify it in films, turning what was once condemned into a symbol of freedom. Meanwhile, indigenous women stayed strong, keeping their rituals and body care alive even amid the violence of colonization. That care wasn't about looks alone, it was an act of continuity. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, photographs showed men and women wearing clothes rich with patterns, fringes, embroidery, and beadwork. Earrings, necklaces, and bracelets worked like a language, telling stories of origin, alliances, and memory. These symbols have crossed generations and now inspire runways and studios, reminding us that tradition isn't a museum piece but a living thread that shapes how we see and reawakens with each generation the meaning of water, body, and dignity. Long before European contact, indigenous women cared for their bodies with remarkable skill. They wore piercings, rings, and necklaces, and made their own oils, shampoos, and dyes, the kind of knowledge that echoes in today's cosmetics. Between rituals, these skills were passed down from one generation to the next, like a recipe shared by the fire. But the same culture that celebrated beauty also imposed strict rules. During menstruation, many women were labeled as impure and kept apart from others, especially during meals. Oral traditions tell of Wisaka, a man who, just before eating, attacked his own grandmother and banned her from the table, claiming that her impurity would anger the gods and put the family at risk. Daily life also changed depending on the way of living. In settled villages, there was usually more care and affection in everyday interactions. Among nomadic groups, however, even though women could have a say in choosing leaders, they were often treated as property. Between progress and contradiction, what stands out is the strength of these women, guardians of knowledge, memory, and survival, who turned limitations into daily practice and held on with persistence to whatever dignity was possible. For centuries, women carried the weight of daily life, cleaning, cooking, raising children, and still being expected to please their husbands. Though it may seem distant, that reality still echoes today. Among nomadic groups, however, their fate, especially that of older women, was even harsher. Seen as a burden, they were given less food and excluded from social gatherings, privileges reserved for younger women in more settled villages. In that context, old age for women was treated as something to be managed, not valued as a source of wisdom. At the same time, there was a paradox. Tribes sought to grow but also controlled fertility so they wouldn't exceed their means of survival. Many indigenous peoples developed natural ways to pause pregnancies, teas, herbs, and rituals to balance the number of mouths to feed during times of scarcity. The goal wasn't to deny life, but to ensure collective survival, keeping resources, migration safety, and the well-being of the whole community in balance. The arrival of the colonizers deeply changed the sedentary tribes and, above all, the lives of women. As men began to see advantages in aligning with the new powers, arrangements emerged that turned women into bargaining chips. Selling or renting them started to be treated as a political strategy, often without their consent or voices being heard. In early encounters, renting women became a gesture of goodwill, like a peace pipe, a ritual to open doors. For some leaders, the birth of a child fathered by a white man could symbolize alliance and protection, tying interests together. Among some peoples, like the Cree, this logic took shape. Young girls were assigned to colonizers to seal agreements, at the cost of silencing their own desires. Diplomacy was born out of intimate relations that brought worlds together but imposed losses on those with the least power. Over time, some of these relationships turned into marriages, giving an appearance of consent to what had started as obligation. In this way, political alliances were inscribed onto women's bodies, while the idea of collective security was used to justify the decisions made. This contradiction, personal relationships used as instruments of state, reveals the price women paid and shows how colonization reshaped emotion, power, and destiny within the villages. For years, people believed that agreements with indigenous nations would only move forward if women were involved. At the same time, some men, tired of what they saw as matriarchal structures and constant disputes, began to see certain arrangements as a way to ease their burdens. With that in mind, it's easier to understand how the indigenous map of the United States was reshaped. From more than 2,200 nations, only about 550 remain today, most of them in reservations in the West. There are still groups in the north and central regions, but they're rare along the East Coast. Among the largest are the Cherokee, with over 300,000 members, and the Navajo, with about 220,000. Other nations, like the Sioux and Chippewa, each have populations just over 100,000. Not all of them have federal recognition. In recent years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has received over 150 petitions, but only a portion has been approved, showing the legal and political barriers that determine who the state acknowledges as a sovereign people. Between internal expectations and institutional filters, today's landscape is the result of negotiations, exhaustion, and choices that continue to shape rights, territories, and the future. Official recognition of tribes is crucial because it grants them the status of sovereign nations, giving them the power to manage their own lands, create their own laws, and set up their own tax systems. The promise is big, but the path is rough. The recognition process moves slowly and demands a heavy price in both time and resources. Even where sovereignty already exists, life on reservations remains full of obstacles. Unemployment is high, infrastructure is weak, stable electricity and quality education are lacking, and food is expensive because the land is poor. This mix takes a toll on health. Diabetes and obesity rates keep rising, and mortality remains high. Faced with this situation, many young people move to cities or take jobs in the gaming industry, which has become an economic backbone for many tribes. In part, that's because casinos on indigenous lands don't pay federal taxes, allowing them to generate revenue that supports basic services and a degree of independence. Some young people continue working with crafts, keeping their inherited traditions alive. But every year, more people leave the reservations in search of education, work, and stability, returning only for brief visits with their families. Between departures and homecomings, the culture endures, though it becomes more refined. It's up to everyone to decide how to preserve it without holding back new paths.